Hey everybody, welcome to the texturing section. Before we jump into adding textures to the model, I need to give you a heads up regarding gamma correcting images that we'll be applying to our model to keep in a linear workflow. First, let me say that this series was recorded using Modo 701. So to keep with the conventions of Modo 701 or earlier, we'll be doing gamma correcting of all the imported images. So if you're using 701 or earlier, you will need to gamma correct your images, which is what we'll be discussing in this section. If, however, you're using Modo 801 or beyond, you will not need to gamma correct your color images. One of the cool new features of 801 is color management, which means that Modo will automatically do the gamma correcting of these images for us. Good times. So for more information about color management and gamma correcting images, please refer to your Modo documentation and or the forums. So with all that said, let's jump into the texturing section. Alright, so this is the texturing part of the project. Now, this part of the process of character development, where we add textures and color to our model, to me as an illustrator and as a character designer, is one of the more satisfying parts of the project. I really enjoy it. We get to see color added to this gray model that we've been working with, and it gives me a lot of satisfaction. The model comes to life and you can really start to see it come together. So it's a good part of the development process, which I enjoy quite a bit. Most of the work that we're going to be doing is going to be in the shader tree, and we'll be discussing a few different types of workflows. Round tripping from Modo to Photoshop back to Modo. We're going to be working with the UVs that we exported out of Photoshop, how to open them up in Photoshop, at what resolution, saving our work, getting those back out of Photoshop, exporting in different formats, and why we export the certain maps certain ways, and how to apply them back into Modo. We're going to be working with a few different kinds of maps, image maps and displacements, procedural textures and bumps. We'll also talk about the strategies for saving the artwork in Photoshop. We'll also talk about the importance of a linear workflow. Working with image maps as we bring them in, we'll talk about gamma correction, making sure our settings are properly set. And then we'll do a lot of texture exploration. Whenever you bring in an image map or a procedural texture, you have access to things like color blend, opacity, and different layering techniques to combine these procedural textures and image maps together even. Then finally, we'll talk about the relationship between texturing, lighting, and rendering, and the importance of setting up your lights prior to the actual creation of the textures. So we'll talk about that relationship. It's really important. So I'm going to switch over to this graphic here. You can see that I've worked ahead and I've textured the model. By texturing it first, it gives us a sort of roadmap, a sort of visual to know the effect that we want to get. And so as we get into the 3D scene, we'll be able to break down these materials part by part and analyze and just sort of deconstruct how these were created. So you'll have a really good understanding of not only the workflows, but the different settings that we've chosen to create the different textures. So just to drill down a little bit further on this, let's look at the top section. So taking a look at the hair, we're going to go through the actual creation of that displacement map, how it's created, and I'll show you some of the sculpting techniques that I used. And then we've added a painted color map on top of that to accentuate the strands of hair. So we'll look at that Photoshop file, how we painted it, and then how it's applied. We've also borrowed from that layered Photoshop file that painted those painted hair strands to create a bump map. So we'll show you how that's constructed. And then finally, with the hair, you can see, especially in her ponytails and this little strand of hair that's coming down across her face, that we're using a stencil map. And that sort of cuts holes in the mesh and sort of creates this illusion of individual strands. It's a really good technique to use, and I think with a combination of the displacement, bump, painted maps, and the stencil map, we really have a nice kind of stylized look to her hair. So moving down to her face, we're going to use Modo's skin shader, and if you haven't used that before, you will. And it's a really great shader. It out of the box, it works wonderfully. It's really, really smooth, and you have a lot of control. So we'll look at the skin shader. And you can notice that she also has some makeup on. So that's a painted map that we've applied. We've targeted one of the epidermal skin layers for that. We'll talk about how to set that up. You can see in her, she has color in her cheeks and her eyelids, and of course her lips, the lip color there. We'll talk about how to apply the texture map for her eyes, and then we'll also talk about the stencil maps that we're using on her eyebrows and her eyelashes to give us that more realistic type of look. And then lastly, with the face, we'll look at the lips, where it looks like a specular highlight. There's no specularity, but it's giving the same effect. And so we'll talk about how we create that map, and then what effect we use to bring that out in the render. And then moving down to her scarf, you can see that we've got a basic transparent material assigned to that mesh layer, and then we've got a simple texture like a mosaic texture, just something that's nice and subtle to give us a little bit of pattern and visual interest. Let's move on to the middle section. So we can talk about her outer shirt. You can see that we've got a few different textures going on, and this is the outer shirt, which is this pink area. We've got a basic procedural texture that's being applied to her UVs that we've exported. And then to break up that pattern, that mechanical looking pattern, I've also applied a bump map, which is a procedural texture. It gives us this sort of bumpiness, this sort of randomness, and you can really see it here in the highlights. And to me, that just gives it a little bit of realism. It's obviously still real stylized, but I think it's a nice bit of a nice realistic touch, and it makes it look less mechanical. And you can see that also we've used the same techniques on her lower shirt, this purple undershirt. The outer shirt, you can see also we've I just sort of added in a little bit of decorative trim here, and that's an image map that's been targeting the UVs for her outer shirt. All right, so we'll talk about how to place that texture, how to combine those procedurals to give us this nice sort of organic surface. So then moving down to her hands, we have just a basic material for her fingernails. It's set to has some reflectivity, and then we'll also use the Modo skin shader for her skin. The dress section is largely it's just going to be an applied image map that we've targeted those UVs. We'll talk about how to place that image and how to resize or adjust the image as it's on the live model. And then we've instanced that texture and then we set it to a subsurface color, which gives us a little bit more pop to the color. So we'll talk about that. And then also you can see that I don't know if it's really clear in the video, but we've also applied, you can see it probably a little bit down here, this roughness, the same sort of roughness pattern that we have in the shirt areas. And that just sort of breaks up the pattern here a little bit more, makes it a little bit more organic, read more like fabric. So moving down to the lower part, we'll take a look at her tights, and we'll talk about how to apply these lines. It's a procedural texture, and how to orient the UVs to make sure that the lines are running vertically and targeting that UV map. We also can see that there's a bump map, so we've borrowed the same procedural texture not only for diffuse color but also for bump. And you can see that with the lighting that we have set up, it gives us a nice little effect, not just for the color difference, but also it picks up a little bit of highlight and shadow, gives us a really nice subtle effect to her tights. And then finally down here with the boots, we'll use several different procedural textures. Now there are a number of ways that you can texture anything in Modo, but I thought it might be fun just to sort of create our own sort of leather type of texture. So we'll discuss how those procedurals are sort of overlapping each other. We have a bump map, and we have a few different procedurals that are set to different color blend modes. We also have an occlusion layer. We have a gradient that's set to bump height. So we're going to cover all that in detail and explain why we have these settings the way that we do. Finally, I guess the heel and the sole of the shoe, which we don't really see that much in the shot, we just apply a basic material to that. So I think we're good to go. We're ready to jump into the 3D scene. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright guys, so before we start to texture the model, we need to get the scene prepped for our texturing process. So this is where we're at right now. We've got all these mesh layers, individual mesh items, and we need to consolidate these. We need to do a lot of things. Let me just show you real quick where we're going. This is the scene that we're going to recreate. Just you can notice that we've got a ground plane, we've got some illuminated polygons in place for our lighting, and obviously we've got the textures in place. So anyway, let's go back to the scene that we are working with. So the first thing I want to do is I want to consolidate all of these mesh items together. Just sort of as a tip or a workflow, it's better to material assign the individual meshes when they're split out like this. Just sort of it'll save you a little bit of time. I want to bring her entire all the geometry up, and I want to put her feet right there on the ground plane. Easiest way to do that, it's select all those geometry layers and then right click and then come down here to merge meshes. Select OK, and it puts everything into one mesh layer. Okay, so that's going to be easy for us to work with when we go to texturing. If you don't see this little widget right there in the middle of the world, like we don't see it over here, let me just point something out to you. If you hit the O key, it'll bring up this little box, and then if you navigate to visibility, where it says show centers, make sure that it has selected. So over here, if you hit O, you can tell that it's not selected. So if we can just change that, you can have a better idea of where the center is. We need to move that center down here to the bottom where her shoes are, so that we can eventually put her up onto that where I want a ground plane to be. You need to switch to item mode to do that. So with your item selected, go here to edit, to let's see, to center, to bounding box, and just put this down at the bottom. Okay, and you can see that that little center widget has snapped down there to the bottom, and that's exactly what we want. So still with that layer selected, come up here under its properties, you can see now its position on the Y is at a negative 80 centimeters and some change. So just select 0 on that, hit return. We can also go ahead and put 0 there too. Select that channel, 0. Okay, so now she's sitting on the ground plane. Alright, spacebar to drop the tool. So now she's in position. Let's add a ground plane under her feet, because there's going to be a small little drop shadow that she's going to cast. So in a new mesh layer, let's navigate to our, I have this collapsed over here, so let's just pull this out. Let's go under our primitives, and if we hit the shift key, we get access to our planes. So it'll just throw that in there. We can scale that up a little bit, and that should be enough to give us a little shadow. Probably too big, but it doesn't matter, that's just fine. And then we need to create some lights for her. First, let's go ahead and material name that. So select that, M on the keyboard. You want to type in your ground material. So let's just put that in there. I'm just going to leave it at its defaults right now. Then let's select the layer that we created. We'll add some lights. Now we're not using traditional lights. You can see I have this directional light which came in just by default. I don't want to use that, so I want to create some illuminated polygons to give us our lighting of the model. I mentioned in the intro the importance of having a lighted scene first before we add textures. Okay, and that's really important, because as you add textures to the model, then if you change the lighting, it's really going to change the textures. So you really want to have that set up. So on a new mesh layer, we'll go to our box tool, and then we'll just draw out just a simple little plane, and then we'll just sort of move this into place. And I've already worked this out in the other scene. I was just showing you how basically we're going to do it. That's going to be about right there. I'm still going to keep that selected. I'm going to hit M to material name this, and I'm going to call this fill light, hit OK. Let's copy that, hit N for new mesh layer, and then paste it. Alright, and then we're just going to rotate that around using an origin action center, which is Alt W, and then Alt S gives us access to our selection action center, which is what we want in this case. So we can move this as we want it, and this is going to be the key light. All right, and we're going to have two of them. One's going to give us, we're going to put that back a little bit, and this is going to give us a lot of illumination to her left side. And then we can select that, copy, paste, and then just move it a little closer and then scale it down. I'm holding the control key. Control key dragging on those little boxes will scale it uniformly to the shape that we want. This is going to give us a little bit more illumination on her face. Just right there, just like that. Now I want these to be, I mean, I could leave them like that, but if you hit D, it's going to subdivide, and then you hit Tab, it's going to soften that to spherical shapes, and I think that's about what I want. So let's go ahead and material name nose. We'll call that key, and just accept the defaults. Okay, so we've got our lights in place. We just need to work with the materials to illuminate our model. So let's go to our shader tree, and with key light, I want this to have a sort of warm glow to it. So I don't need any diffuse, so I hit 0. I don't need any specular, 0 on that. And go down here to your material transitive properties, and then let's select down here in the illumination, let's just select, I think it's going to be about 8, but let's just say 6. Okay, and that's, you can see that immediately we get some light on those panels. We're going to check the preview here in a second. With this luminous intensity value, you can also change the color. So we wanted to make this a little bit warmer. All right, so let's just select that little color bar down there and just make it a little bit warmer like that. Now let's label our work with our fill color. So again, just like the key color, key light, we don't need any diffuse, we don't need any specular, and let's add a little bit of illumination to this. And I think this is going to be 2, and we want to make this a little cooler in color. We'll just see how that looks. So now we've got our lights set up. Let's set up the ground plane. Now with 701 we have this new feature where we select that, we right click, and we can go to create item shader. Alright, so when we do that, we create a shader right on the actual item. What that does, it gives us access to shader properties. Alright, and that's really great. So what we want to do is just keep all of this as it is, but we want to change the alpha type from opacity to shadow catcher. And what that's going to do, it's going to hide this plane, but it'll actually catch the shadows that are going to be cast from our light sources. We want to do something similar to the illuminated polygons. So we'll select that one, we'll right click our fill light, go down here to create item shader, same sort of thing, but with this one, I don't want this to be visible to the camera, because we might have a camera angle, let's just say that's like this. Okay, and then we'll actually see some of that illuminated polygon in our shot. All right, so we don't want that. Well, we can control that by turning its visibility off, just like that. We're going to do the same thing with the key light. Just turn the visibility to the camera off. So let's hit F8 just to bring up preview and see where we're at. So we've got some light on our subject. We've got this cool light coming in. We've got a little bit of warm light here, and that's pretty nice. We can see that our shadow catcher is working. All right, so that's cool. That's working. Let's go over to, just so it's not so horizontal, let's change the format of this. So we'll select our render node, And then under the frame, we have access to the resolution or the frame size. I believe this is going to be, let's just say 2100 by 3600 pixels. And that gives us this vertical format. I think that's pretty close to what our other scene is. Okay, and this is much easier to work with. Obviously much easier to see. Next thing I want to do, you can see I've got this clay material, this clay material right on top of the shader tree. What we can do is actually turn that down just a little bit, maybe just about halfway. Okay, so maybe more than just a little bit. So we can have a better sense of what our lighting is going to do. Alright, so this will get us in the ballpark of our lighting situation, so that when we apply textures to it, we can sort of adjust what we want, what we don't want. Another thing that I want to mention to you is that we need to set up an environment. So we're working with this gray area. See, by default, we have this 4-color gradient material. Alright, so what we want to do is we can have multiple environments. So let's do this. We're going to right click on that. We're just going to duplicate it. Alright, so you can see that we have two environments. We're going to select the top one, and want to add a, we can either add a constant to that, or we can just change this to constant. And that's easy enough. But I want to select that environment node, and I want it to be visible to camera only. Okay, so it's not getting any sort of light information from the background. We're only seeing it represented visually, and it's just all white. And you can see how well that shadow catcher is working down there. With this second environment selected, we want it to be hidden from the camera, and we want it to be responsible for the indirect rays and this other business. So I want to change this gradient to a constant, and I want to turn that down a little bit. And you can see that we can turn it down really dark, and the background is not affected because we have told the first environment to only be visible, and we're telling the second environment, the one that we're working with now, to affect the model. So anyway, that's just a couple of really neat little workflows. You can combine these together, and if you're doing something a little bit more advanced, maybe if you have some more reflective materials, then you can do some image-based lighting. But basically that covers the setup of the environments. The final thing I believe that I want to touch on is our final color output. So we'll select that node, and by default every Modo scene comes with an alpha output and a final color output. Now we're going to get to this in a little bit more intensely when we get to the rendering part, but it's important for us to be at least sensitive to this so that when we set up our materials, it's all correct and we're working in a linear color space. Now you can see right now that this is a mistake. I'm working on a 1.6, and that's not good. I want to go to 2.2, and you can see how it changes right here. And you can see also that if I had applied textures to the model and I was working with a 1.6 final color output, that it would just break my heart. I'd have to go back and then redo my textures. So you want to make sure to eliminate that headache and that heartache by making sure your final color output is set to your system gamma, which in my case is 2.2. Alright, so we've got our materials in place. We've got just kind of placeholders for all the different materials that we want to assign. We've got a shadow catcher down here for the base, for what she's standing on. We have general placement of our illuminated polygons, and I think we're about ready to jump over to our final scene, or the textured scene, and sort of deconstruct that to see how these textures are applied. Alright, so here we are in the Render tab. Now in this section we're going to be drilling down a little bit deeper into the materials and sort of deconstructing the materials that we've already established for our textured model. A couple of things I just want to point out to you before we get going into it is if you click under the Options tab here, you have access to the things that the preview will display or what they won't display. And you can see that I've got the displacements turned off. Okay, and that's just to say we're asking a lot of preview right now because it's calculating everything, all these different textures, displacement, bump, subsurface scattering, diffuse. So just by turning this off, this displacement, which we have a displacement texture in her hair, it's going to give us a little bit better performance. Let's talk about the materials. We've got a lot of different things going on, and we're going to talk about all of them. And there's going to be some overlap, so meaning that we use the same sorts of techniques throughout. So I'm going to try and keep things focused and not repeat myself too much. But when I'm working with something like this, I typically will zoom in on an area, select the geometry that I want to work on, and then hide everything else, just to make things simpler. So that's what we're going to do now. We'll start with the sleeves, which is sort of a basic material. Let's deconstruct that as a place to start. So with that geometry selected, I'm going to hit Shift H, and it's going to hide everything that's unselected. Just going to zoom in here a little bit better for us. I think it's going to be a little easier, definitely easier to see. Let's just take a look at this material as preview sort of resolves this. So you can see that we've got several different things going on. We've got this local color of this pink sleeve, and then we've got a pattern for the shirt texture itself, the material. We've also got a bump pattern, which is you can see, really finely in here. You can see that there's a little bit of a bump going on right here with these stitches, looks like. And then also we want to break that up a little bit, and so you can see some irregular texture that's going on there, and that just gives us a little bit more of a realistic look. It's still sort of stylized, but it's a little bit more how fabric would actually look, and so I sort of work that out. So let's deconstruct that. We can select, we just click in the viewport here in the preview, and it selects our material. And let's talk about how this material is constructed. We have three different procedural textures that are being applied to this material. All right, we're just going to turn those off and talk about from the underneath, this basic base material, and then we'll talk about how these others are constructed and why we're using them the way that we are. Alright, so first off, we want to establish a local color. So we have a material assignment. We have, I've just chosen some colors that I feel like work good together. We have a little bit of subsurface scattering going on. We'll talk about that in a second. So first off, I want this texture to be sort of rough, okay? So I'm set my roughness to 100%. I'm going to have a little bit of reflectivity in there, so I've bumped that up to 5%, something that's, sort of small. And then a little bit of Fresnel, not too much. I've also selected blurry reflections, and I've bumped up the reflection rays from its default setting of 64 up to 256. Okay, that's just going to give me a little bit better quality of the reflections. Right now, I've also turned on this double-sided. Okay, so this is, the geometry is only single-sided here, so if you turn that off, you can see that we're actually seeing through the underside of it. So by turning that on, it makes it, as the name implies, double-sided, which will give us a nice shadow on the arm down here. All right, so we'll typically use that double-sided material throughout all of our textures, or most of them. Let's talk about a little bit about subsurface scattering. We have a subsurface scattering amount of 25%, which is basically, it's kind of low, but it gives us a nice color, and then we just set this color to something, again, that sort of works. So there's a relationship with what color is being scattered, that subsurface, what color do we want to show through, and I've sort of tempered this color with our diffuse color. Sometimes I will lower this diffuse color down a little bit, or this diffuse amount down a little bit, and then bump up the subsurface scattering a little bit more to make it a little bit more translucent. Right? So, but in this case, these settings work pretty well. And I've also set the scattering distance to something pretty low, like 1 millimeter. In this case, I could go a little bit lower than that if I wanted. You don't want to go much higher than that because we have geometry that's underneath this. And if we bump this up a little bit higher, to say 3 or 4 or 5 millimeters instead of just this one, then we might start to see a little bit of that skin coming through, just being underneath that, and that's really not what we want. So I've set this scattering distance pretty low. All these others are set I've just kept the defaults on those. One thing to take note of, if you go to your render tab, just click on that render node. By default, the global illumination, if you look over here to our subsurface scattering, it's going to be set to direct only. Well, we're going to be using a lot of subsurface scattering, so we want to make sure that right off the bat we have this set to both, so that we can actually see the subsurface scattering in the preview and then ultimately in the render. So now that's in place. We've got one other thing that's a little bit different is my reflection color. So by default, when you have reflection, you're going to get a white reflection color just by default. Well, I wanted to introduce a little bit more color in here. A lot of my images have a lot of color. This we can get sort of for free, this extra little bit of punch of purple or pink. So I've set that reflection color to something that's going to match this family of pinks that we already have in the shirt. Let's talk about the materials that we have assigned here, or these procedural textures. Okay, so the first thing is this lattice material. So you get there by going to Add Layer, down to this Modo Enhanced Modo Textures, and then this one is set to one of these lattices. Okay, and I've just chosen one that I think works pretty well. So you assign that procedural texture, and then when you make that assignment, you have to tell Modo what to do with it. You go under your texture locator, and we want to make this wrap around this texture to be wrapping around in a convincing way around this sleeve, and we do that through the UVs. All right, so we need to target our projection type should be set to UV, and then also the UV map needs to be set to the appropriate map that we've already established, which is this undershirt. You have a lot of different settings when you apply lattice materials or any of the procedural materials, and by default I believe that this was set to 1. So let me just change this to 1 horizontal wrap and 1 vertical wrap, and you can see how that procedural texture changes here. We're still using this UV map, this projection type of UV, and it's still wrapping around. It's just the size has changed. Just sort of made an aesthetic choice to make this a little bit smaller, like the pattern on this shirt. Come up here. If you're familiar with Photoshop and how it works with blend modes, you can see that I've got this lattice and is set to overlay. Alright, so by default, let me just change this back to normal, and I have this effect set to diffuse amount. By default, this would probably be set to diffuse color. So let's just show you what that looks like. We've got a black and white representation of that texture. Okay, and you can see it very clear now how it wraps around, and that's really, really nice. So just right click on that, change that to diffuse amount, and you can see the effect. That's what's happening right here. This is a really great preview. It's just so wonderful about displaying your textures so quickly. But still, this is set to normal. I want to blend this in a little bit more. So I could change my blend mode to any of these, but I like to use overlay quite a bit because it pumps up the white, and the white pumps up the color, and then the black also keeps some saturation, but it just makes it a darker version of what it's on top of. So that's basically the setting for our lattice material. Let's move up to the bump. I've worked hard to get this setting just right. Okay, the size, the wrap, how many times this procedural texture is going to wrap around. I don't want to recreate that, so I can make what is called an instance. All right, so if you right click on that material, go here to say create instance, and this is exactly what we have here. So you can see that now this material is an instance which retains the same properties as the sort of the parent. Okay, so what you instanced, right? So it retains the same properties, but we can change its effect. We have some different parameters that we can change. But well, let's talk about that, and I'll talk about why we do that instead of just duplicating the material. All right. So this lattice is set to bump. It's targeting our undershirt, same sort of thing, same sort of horizontal and vertical wrap. And you can see that I've set the opacity down to 10%. Let's just bump this up to 100%, and you can see it's much more of a bumpy material. This is set to bump. I know that I want to bump here. Well, how do you control the amount of distance that this is offset? How do you what's the other setting for that? Well, select the material that we're working with, and you can see down here at the bottom we have a bump amplitude. So this is set to what I feel like is a good distance, 3 millimeters in this case. So that's how, if we wanted to bump that up or down, we have the ability to do that. I can affect it even more by turning the opacity of this instance lattice down a little bit. So let's do that. Turn it back down to 10%, and you can see that it's a much nicer, more subtle look to it. Okay, so we have some color difference, and we also have some bump. All right, so it's picking up some of the light a little bit better. If I made a decision about making this, say this was too small, let's say, and I wanted to make this a little bit larger, let's just say 1, I can do that and not have to worry about this instance updating. Okay, it's going to update for me. So you can see that the horizontal and the vertical wrap have been updated because it's inheriting some of these properties. All right, so it's a good sort of workflow to keep in mind. You can change this back down. Just go back to 5. And you can see we're back to where we started, and our lattice is also reflecting this 5% vertical wrap and horizontal wrap. Let's talk about this final material, which I love this name, cheesy. I have no idea where that came from, but that's cool. This cheesy material, let's find that under here, under enhanced Modo textures, down to organic. Okay, and there it is right there. Now, you've got a lot of different choices here. So we have a number of different wonderful things to choose from. It just depends on the look that you're going for. With what I wanted to do, this seemed to me like to be a good pattern to start with, a good procedural texture to start with. We can combine different procedurals and we can project them in different ways. Okay, we're not limited to just one way of projecting them per material. We can break it up a little bit, and that gives us a lot of flexibility for various art looks. This particular one, I didn't necessarily want to target the UVs. I just wanted it to have sort of a global bumpiness to it, just to get this sort of crinkled pattern. So you can see that I've set my projection type to solid. Okay, I have access to these other kinds of projections, but this to me is going to work really well. You also have access to changing the size of this particular material. Let me just change this back to diffuse color, and then you can see how this is represented. This procedural texture is being projected in a solid way. So you have white and black and gray, and it's creating all of that, the effect of bump. And I want this bump to be combined with this lattice bump as well, and so I've set this to add, and it's still at 100%. I can dial this down if I wanted to, but I think this works fine for us. So when we turn this all on, you can see with the combination of our material, which has some reflectivity to it, it's got a nice bit of reflection color, which gives us a good bit of color impact. We've got this lattice material that's set to diffuse amount, which is sort of knocking back this negative between the stitches and is sort of pumping up the color of the raised stitches. And we borrowed from that, just created an instance for our initial bump, and that's going to just sort of accentuate the pattern a little bit more. dial that down in opacity just to make it a little bit more subtle. And then we've combined that with the cheesy the cheesy bump. So this is the sort of pattern that you'll see these again, especially this cheesy bump. I'm going to be using that on some of the other pieces of fabric. But that sort of wraps up the sleeve area. So let's move on to something that's a little bit more complex, and that's coming up next. Alright, so now let's take a closer look at her outer shirt. Now, the way that we constructed the materials on her outer shirt are basically the same using the same ideas that we've used to create the textures in her undershirt, but with one big difference, and that's this graphic on the trim of her sleeve. Okay, so we're really going to focus on that in this section. But just to review quickly, we have this Trichex pattern, which is making up the actual pattern of the fabric, the weave of the fabric, and it's applied to a particular UV map, which is her outer shirt in this case. And we have this cheesy pattern, which is responsible for this sort of randomness of bumpiness that's typical of fabric, just to give us that realism, a little bit of more realism. And then again, the material that we're using as a base, it is set to double-sided, and we have similar properties that we had on her undershirt, but with just slight differences. And so what I want to encourage you to do is pay more attention to what it looks like, what the image looks like in the preview versus what you think it should be over here in these different properties. So if it is right over here, it may or may not look correct in the preview. So let the preview drive your sort of artistic choices. We also have some subsurface scattering, again set to a scattering distance which is pretty low of 1 millimeter, because those sleeves are going to go up underneath her outer shirt, and so we don't want that to show through like if it would set to something that's higher, a scattering distance that's a little bit higher. So let's focus on how to create this graphic and how to apply it, how we use our UVs. So we're going to use a little bit of a new workflow. What I want you to do is navigate towards your vertex map list, and under our UV maps you can see we have access to all of the maps in our project. We have this outer shirt, which is what we want to target. So we go under texture to export UVs to EPS. Alright, so once we export that, let's bring that in. See if I can find there we go. So now this is the exported UV map. So we want to open this up in Photoshop. So we drag that into Photoshop. And then when it opens up in Photoshop, when an EPS opens in Photoshop, it's going to ask you a couple of questions. Firstly is, what size do you want it? Well, I want this to be a 4K image, so I'm going to put in 4096, and I want this to be an RGB image. So I click OK, and it's going to populate. Let me just bring this in from my other screen. Can't see it right now because it's on, you have thin lines on a transparent background. So I'm going to create a layer underneath that. Going to select the wires. I'm just going to duplicate that just so that we can see what we're working with a little bit better. Alright, so now we're in Photoshop. We have our imported UV file, our EPS, and it's a 4K image. So now we know precisely where to place these graphics for our sleeves. So I'm going to move this over and just bring in the prepared file. So this is the same idea. We have our UVs on one layer. We have our prepared graphic on one layer. And then just for demonstration purposes, because I want this graphic to be white, I put a gray background here just so that we're not looking at this. Just so you can see the graphic better. So I've determined the size that I want this graphic to be and the placement of where on the sleeve that I want it. Okay, so I'll save this. This is the next part of the workflow is I like to save a master file, a master layered Photoshop file, just in case I want to go back, maybe resize these flowers, or change. Maybe we want a graphic on another part of the shirt. I have a layered Photoshop file that I have access to all these layers that I can make edits to very freely, and then just save off a copy, whether it's a PNG file or a JPEG or a TIFF. I have a master file that I can always use. Okay, so that's the one thing that I've just kind of learned through trial and error works pretty well. So let's talk about this specific graphic and how we're going to apply it in Modo. So we have this layered Photoshop file, but obviously we don't need all these layers to be pulling all that back into Modo. We only need the graphic, which is these white flowers, which are in the proper position. We don't need these wires, and we don't need this gray background. So what we're going to do is just going to turn all these off. So you can see I only have that white graphic. Now I'm just going to save a copy of this, and I'm just going to call this outer shirt PNG. I use a PNG format because it's relatively low in terms of size, and although Modo can handle layered Photoshop files, if you're delivering a heavily layered Photoshop file, if you're pulling those back into Modo and you've got a lot of different textures, it's really a lot of weight. It's gonna for the project. So it's a better idea, in my opinion, to just save off what you need, keep that master Photoshop file for edits, but then when you're delivering files, the textures and the files that you have are much more lightweight and easy to use down the pipeline. So we're going to save this off as a PNG. We've already done that, so hit save, and then we'll come back to Modo. We'll make sure that our outer shirt is targeted and we're in our shirt material. Just going to turn this outer shirt off, this graphic. We're just going to bring it back in. So go under add layer to image map to load image, and then we're going to navigate to our outer shirt graphic, which you can see it's very low. It's only 266 kilobytes, so it's just very, very low, very lightweight and perfect because we can bring that in. It's targeting our UV outer shirt. You can see that here with the projection type is UV, outer shirt is the particular map, and we've got it precisely where we want it. So that's the workflow. I'm just going to turn that off and turn back on our original. Then we can just take a quick look at the different properties of that graphic. You can see that I have the blend mode is set to normal. I've lowered the opacity down a little bit just to blend it in a little bit more, just so it looks a little bit nicer, a little bit more integrated into this material. And I kind of like the way that looks. One last thing I want to mention before we move on is that when you bring this in, if you look over here on this anti-aliasing, this may or may not be checked. Just turn that off. Okay, it's going to anti-aliasing is going to soften the graphic, which is not what you want. Okay, you don't want anything. You want, especially with really crisp graphics, make sure that's off. You don't have to worry about gamma correcting this particular image because it's just white, so you can leave that untouched. So I think we're pretty good. We can move on to the next section. I'm pretty happy with the way that that's looking. So now let's take a closer look at her legs, or how we're going to represent these tights on this model. We've got a basic material starting with, and again, it's similar properties. We have some reflectivity, a little bit of Fresnel, blurry reflections, and we've bumped up the reflection rays. Okay, so we've also have pretty high roughness. We have a little bit of subsurface scattering going on, again with a scattering distance that's pretty low of 1 millimeter, and you can see that the subsurface color, the reflective color, and then the diffuse color are all sort of similar, maybe just with a little bit of value difference between them and a little bit of temperature difference. So we just sort of set those like we want them, and then just sort of combine them together in a way that gives us a nice blend of just this final color result. So we have a few different textures going on in addition to our basic material. We've got a bump texture, which are these stripes, and then we have an instance of that texture which gives us our color. So let's take a look at that. Well, I guess we'll look at the diffuse color first. So that gives us a little bit of color, and then we have a little bit of bump. Alone, those don't really work so well, but together I think they give us a nice result. Alright, so let's take a look of how we're going to recreate. Let's just sort of deconstruct this and recreate it. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is to target the UV map, because I want these stripes, which is a procedural texture, to target these legs, so it's going to wrap around. So we already have UVs for that leg, so make sure that that UV map is selected, and then we're going to go to add layer, down to textures, down to grid. Within grid, we have a few different types that we can use. So by default, it comes in as square. Let's just change that to line. And then we want to change the projection type from solid by default to target our UV. So we'll select our UV map and make sure that under map we have this legs UV map targeted. Okay, so now that we see these stripes are targeting that UV map. Obviously they're oriented wrong compared to how we have our UV map set up. So let's change that. A couple different ways that you can alter the way that the texture is applied to the UV. One way that you can do it, if you double click on that actual UV map, it'll bring up the UV map dedicated viewport for that. And you can rotate this should you want to. Just rotate that around to something that is more horizontal. Gives you that vertical look because the lines are running horizontally by default. That's one way to do it. But another way, and the way I like to do it, is go under texture locator, and down here where it says UV rotation, let's just change this to 90 degrees. And that's going to rotate those UVs for us. Then it's just a matter of going through and adjusting the properties. We can change the line width to say 25 times 25, I think is what it is. Also, I want to change the wrap. So I want this to wrap around a few more times. So maybe 7, I think is what we have. So it gives us a pretty good balance of white and black. And then we can change this. Let me just turn these off. And we can change this from diffuse color. Let's just change this to bump. So we have a nice bump. You can see that as the light hits it. But we also, again, we want to come back to our material and set our bump amplitude. All right, so it's set pretty low at 600 UM. So I think that's, and I've kind of worked that out, so I'm comfortable with that. The next thing we can do is to instance this grid to get our color. So we can right click on that, so create an instance, and we'll change this from bump to diffuse color. So now we've got two things going on. We've got a bump and our diffuse color. Now that diffuse color obviously is not what we want, so let's change some of those properties in there. You can see that we've inherited with this instance the grid properties, which are the line width and the transition width. So that's working just fine. Let's change our blend mode. Okay, so we can get a little bit more creative with this. I'm just going to change this to overlay. I like to use that. And then I'll turn this down a little bit, maybe like 75%. It's still a little bit strong. So I can affect this line color, hold down the shift key, and you can just drag to the right within that color bar. And you can see that we get a much more subtle look. And this is, there are a number of ways you can get the same effect, but this is just something that I like to use. It pumps up the white of the grid pattern, pumps up the color underneath, and the black, or the dark value in this case, kind of pushes back this darker green, but still retains that sort of color saturation. So we've recreated this. We've got this bump texture, which gives us a nice hit of light on there. You can see how when the light hits it, it's picking up a nice little highlight and then a shadow. And then in conjunction with this diffuse color instance, we've got our final look. So let's move on to the next part. So now let's take a look at her scarf. I wanted to show you a couple things about the geometry first before we looked at the preview, and just to discuss a little bit of my decision making about how we handled this material. Initially I thought that I would have this material be thick meaning a front and a back. It would all be just kind of a thick garment that's like in real life. But when I apply the material to the scarf and I assigned some transparency to it, it didn't look quite right. I've got a pattern on here, and I was getting a sort of a double pattern. So what I did to combat that is just delete the inside, or delete the thickness that I initially had. And I've kept this little rim around here just to give the illusion of a little bit of thickness. You can see that I've done that on the collar section as well as on this back section, keeping that rim of geometry just to give that illusion of thickness. Let me just show you here in the render view what I'm talking about specifically. So you can see that I've got some transparency going on, which I like, but again, that mosaic material procedural that I have in place now, I was just getting at double pattern, and so it was looking a little bit busy. But I think that eliminating that interior, the thickness to it really works well. Let's just take a look at the material, sort of dissect that a little bit. It's a pretty simple material. Let's just walk through it. Diffuse color it's obviously red, so we really want a big punch of color, so the diffuse amount is set pretty high. We also have a reflection color of red, which sort of reinforces that red, gives us a nice punch to it. The roughness is pretty high, it's set to 100, and then again blurry reflections, and I bumped up the reflection rays. The material transitive properties, you could tell that I have a little bit of transparency going on. So when I'm assigning a transparent material or any sort of material, really, again, I'm looking towards this preview and making a judgment call as to what it looks like over here, paying less attention to the actual settings and just sort of making my choices based off of how well it looks and interacts with the other materials around it. So I want to encourage you to do the same. Let's take a look at this mosaic material. Now, just like we've targeted UVs for the other parts of the geometry, we've done the same with this mosaic material. Again, so that's a procedural. We'll go to Enhance Modo Textures, and then down here to Tiles, and then we just find that mosaic texture there. And then we can just set the scale, like we want it. Make sure that the UV map is set to our specific UV. So we have a little bit more control over some of these other settings. I don't think that I changed them too much. Anyway, I want to encourage you to sort of play around with these different procedurals as you bring them in. Just see how they look. You can tell that I have a blend mode set to hard light, which is similar to overlay, but it just gives us a little bit more of a sharper effect. And it's also set to diffuse amount. And I have it turned down pretty low. So initially, it comes in at 100%. You can tell that obviously that's not going to work. So just use your creative judgment to make those sort of decisions. And for me, I think that works pretty well. Talking about why we created this geometry straight versus curved is that it's my opinion that it's better to have, in this particular case, this garment, creating UVs straight like this will give you a more accurate pattern, so that when we get to the posing part, we have an accurate pattern to work with. Alright, so that's really the scarf. So let's move on to the next part. Alright, so now let's take a look at her dress, or her skirt here. It's a very simple geometry, and we can see that we've applied an image to her skirt, and it's targeting those UVs. So let's just take a look at the materials and see what we've got. The diffuse amount is set to 100%, okay, because I want that image to be fully represented in terms of color and all the other materials here. So I'll set that really high, the maximum of 100. You can see the properties over here. We've got a high amount of roughness. We do have a little bit of reflection and a little bit of Fresnel. Again, blurry reflections with a bumped up number of reflection rays. And then in the material transitive properties, we have a subsurface amount of 100% and then a subsurface color, and this is sort of a very light gray. But let's turn our attention to this floral pattern that we have applied. We can tell from the texture locator where we're targeting a UV map and our dress UV right here. So we know that it's mapped right onto that particular UV map, so that's good. we go back here, we can see that we have a gamma correction of 0.4546. We're going to talk about that in a minute. We have instanced this floral pattern and we're using it as a subsurface color. So we're familiar with instancing, so there's no need to actually apply this texture again or double up on that texture when we can just instance it and change the properties. What we've done is to right click in this effects column and then we've changed this to subsurface color, and we can access that through our basic channels here down to subsurface color. And then we have this cheesy texture right on top, which gives us sort of again, we've seen this before, and it helps to sort of soften that pattern a little bit, make it look more like fabric and less like, you know, plastic. So how do we bring in a color map and map it to those UVs? So we've seen that in the outer shirt. Let's recreate this, and I'll show you how we're going to do gamma correction and that sort of thing. We're going to just turn those layers off. I go up here to add layer. We're going to load that image. So go down to image map and then load image. And then up here we're going to find that floral pattern. Now this is a tileable texture, so it doesn't matter. We don't have to have exported UVs and then match this up. We could if we wanted something that's really specific, but we don't have to have that. So we can just go ahead and add that in, open that up. We can tell that we have 100% subsurface. Let's just turn that down, subsurface amount down pretty low. Okay, just so we can see that pattern. Let's just take a look at what we've done here. So we've wrapped this like 1.2, 1.2, and what that does is just it resizes the texture for us. So let's do that. We have this, what we're working with, so 1.2, tab 1.2. Okay, and that just sort of resizes it for us. Now it's real light, okay, and we need to gamma correct this image. Let's go under our texture layer, and here where it says gamma, it comes in as a default of 1. Okay, well that's not quite what we want. I'm working with a 2.2 gamma on my system, so I'm just going to use some division. So we're going to divide 1 by 2.2, and that gives us this 0.4546. So now this image that we just imported is gamma correct in terms of color. Now I want to bring your attention to a couple of other things. I'm just going to turn that off for a second, turn these back on, and I'm just going to direct your attention to this UV tile offset, the U tile and then the V tile. You have various different ways that you can move this texture around. And what I mean by that is, so if I just move this one way or the other, you can see it move this texture around for me. So this is a really kind of built-in way for you to if there's a particular pattern that you want, like if you wanted these flowers over here, or you wanted to move this image around a little bit, you could sort of explore this a little bit. And even if we wanted to rotate this, let's just say we wanted to rotate it 15 degrees or so, you can see that we have control over a lot of our pattern in terms of how it's applied and where we can move it around. So keep that in mind. You can see also that the horizontal repeat is set to repeat, vertical repeat set to repeat. We're not going to run into because it's a seamless pattern, we won't, if we have this set to something like reset or to like edge, we might get gaps along the edges. Let's go back here to the one that we brought in. We have this diffuse color. It's color corrected. It's gamma corrected, I mean. It's set to diffuse color, which is what we want. We're going to right click on that and then just create an instance. And then we're going to, in the effects column, right click and go to our basic channels and go down here to subsurface color. Make sure that's selected. Now come down to our base material, and then we're going to go to material transitive properties, subsurface amount of 100%. Okay, and that's really going to pop that color off just a little bit more. Okay, it's not completely necessary, but it's there, and in my opinion, just use what's there. So really, that is it. Once we have that, we can apply that cheesy texture in there. We get that sort of breakup effect right along in here. You can see it a little bit more. You can see it just sort of modulates some of that color in there. Again, it sort of softens that look a little bit because this is a very strong graphic. So I think that wraps up the skirt. We're ready to move on. Alright, so now let's have a look at the boots. Now the boots are a lot more complicated in terms of just number of materials, but there's a logic here, and really, all of these are just sort of artistic choices that I've made based off of the look that I wanted to get. One thing that I could have done, because we have this upper boot, we have UVs for it, is I could have applied an existing texture, like a leather texture to it, like a photograph, and be done with it. But I thought it might be just more interesting to sort of recreate some sort of leather or some sort of cool looking material, just to sort of highlight some of the flexibility and artistic abilities that Modo has in terms of applying procedural textures and how they relate to one another. So first off, let's real quickly, the lower boot, like the sole and the heel, it's just a simple material assignment with a little bit of reflectivity. Nothing that we haven't seen before, so we're just going to skip by that and go right to the boot. Let's deconstruct this a little bit. First off, we have our base material layer, which has a basic diffuse amount. We have some colored no specularity. We have colored reflective color. It's this warmer sort of yellowy. It just gives us a little bit of warmth here. Again, we've seen this before. Blurry reflections, bumped up reflection rays to 256, a little bit of reflection in Fresnel, and then no subsurface scattering in this particular case. You could use a little bit like we've done before, but not completely necessary. And it is double-sided. Not that we necessarily need it, but I always like to sort of turn that on just so that I can get a good shadow in there in case we have sort of an upshot and we're looking through here. We're not just looking through down there in the hole or something. Okay, so I like to turn that on. Let's drill down a little bit more into the actual, how this is constructed. And by the way, you see me hovering my mouse over a certain section. If you're not used to, you don't know what I'm doing, Preview is a really cool tool in that wherever your mouse is, you can hover your mouse over and just sort of, it'll resolve right underneath that cursor. If there's a certain section that you want resolved faster than the others, just hover that mouse over your cursor over that area and just sort of sweep around, and it'll clean that up right underneath there. So that's just a little tip. So let's deconstruct this a little bit. We've got an occlusion layer, a gradient, marble vein, spot coloring, noise. We have several things going on. So let's take a look at those. Just going to turn all of them off just to start with, so we can see our basic material. We add a little bit of noise to there. You can see that there's a little bit of a subtle texture that's starting to happen. Alright, let's turn that off. I'm going to turn on this, and by the way, that little noise right there is that's a bump map. I should probably, let's talk about that just real quickly. Again, we've seen this before, where how we control this noise, or I should say a bump, by going to our base material and then making sure that our bump amplitude is set appropriately. And this is what I feel like works good for this particular case. These aren't going to be in the shot very much, and we're not going to see much of any of that. But just in case, you always want to sort of build your assets to the particular output that you need. But I just like to have that in there, and I think it helps with this demonstration too. So bump amplitude set to 150 UM. Just going to turn that off, and I'm going to turn this spot coloring on. Now this is just a noise. You can see I've made let me just turn this so we can see it better. You can see I'm making use of our blend modes and opacity. These are just sort of creative choices that I'm making. Alright, so I'm just going to bump this up to 100% so we can see this a little bit better. You can start to see this white and black material, or you can see the effect here, and it's sort of subtle with this particular blend mode of normal. Okay, but if I change this to color burn, you can really see that effect a little bit more. Maybe color dodge. That's not it. Let's go back to color burn, and then just turn this opacity down a little bit. This is sort of breaking up this uniformity of the color underneath here. Just going to change that back down to 40%. That's going to give us a little bit of what I want. So a little bit of discoloration in here, okay, sort of more organic looking. All right, and then we also have this marble vein texture. Okay, this is one of many of the Modo enhanced textures that you can find. It's under noise, so marble vein, and then just sort of set the properties like you want them. You can see it's real subtle. I turn this spot coloring noise layer off. You can see this a little bit better, and you can see it's not quite there. So what I wanted to do is to add a gradient to sort of accentuate that bump texture. Okay, you can see that marble vein noise texture is set to bump, and but the bump is really low. So that's where this next layer comes in. This is our gradient layer. You can see that the addition of this gradient layer, you can see now those veins are really starting to come out. And the way that we do that is this gradient, and we can create a gradient by going to processing to add gradient. I'm just going to put that in there. I'm going to turn it off. We're going to come back to that in a second. Let's focus on what we have, the one that we have in place, and look at its properties. When you have this gradient in place, it's going to come in like an incidence angle. But we want to change that. And so we go under our surface parameters to bump height. So that's set to bump height. And what that allows us to do, I'm going to set, you can see that again, I'm sort of playing with the blend modes and the opacity. I'm just going to change this back to normal and up to 100% so we can see that what's working with that gradient. Because this gradient is set to bump height, the black is going to go down in the valleys, and the hills or the high points are going to be white. So when you set that from a blend mode of normal, which is where we're at, to something like multiply, you really see the highs and lows accentuated that much more. Now obviously that's too strong, so I just back that down to see what 20% looks like. Okay, and that gets me closer to what I want. You might want to go a little bit higher than that, maybe 30%. You can really start to see that detail come out. That might be a little high, but maybe let's just compromise at 25%. But so this gradient that's set to bump height and our marble vein, which is set to bump, are working in conjunction with one another. So let's look at this occlusion layer and see what that's all about. Again, I'm using a blend mode of color burn rather than normal. But if we just set this to normal, you can see this, what's happening here. One thing to take note of is when you create an occlusion layer, let's just do that. Let's go to processing to occlusion. You have some different options here, and by default it comes in the type at uniform. Well, in this particular case, I wanted to bring out the creases a little bit more, so I changed this to concavity. And so that's going to really sort of dial in, make this, wherever it's more concave, it's going to get a little bit darker. And then we just use that, we change our blend mode from normal to multiply. And then we can turn that down, the opacity down a little bit. Turn that off. You can see that I've turned that down quite a bit. To concavity, blend mode. Let's go down to color burn, and that's going to do, it's going to keep that value, but it's going to introduce a little bit more color versus going with something like a multiply. Multiply looks a little heavy to me, and this is a real subtle thing, but I like to use color burn sometimes. So with all those things combined, we get this nice custom-made leather type texture. I want to show you how to create a gradient before we wrap this up. Just let that resolve a little bit so we can have another look at it. So I'm going to turn off the layers that we're not going to use and demonstrate how we use that gradient that we brought in. So we have a basic gradient that we created. Now over here, I like to open this up. You can do it right here within this window, but I like to have a little bit more space. So with these RGB colors selected, we're going to change this base color to black. All right, everything's going to go black. Now, I want to create another key down here. So I'm going to middle click in here, select that. I'm going to bring that all the way up to white, or up here to 1. Then I'm going to pull this down a little bit. Just so that we can see what we're doing, we need to change our input from incidence to bump height. So go to surface parameters to bump height. Make sure that everything's selected that we want. Let's adjust this a little bit so we can actually see. We need to bring our marble vein back so we can actually see what it is that we're adjusting to. If we bring this down, you can see it's going to adjust the amount of value that we have in this gradient. We could bring this up too if we wanted to have a little bit more, less. Let's just adjust this a little bit more. If we wanted a lighter low value, we can also adjust this too. Okay, but I want to keep that pretty low, and I want to keep that pretty high, and then just put this curve in here, and that just sort of modulates between the white and the black. We need both of these on. This marble vein is set to bump, and then again, let me just turn that off, that original gradient off. This other gradient set to diffuse color, just so that we can see it. The blend mode, oh, this is in the way, isn't it? The blend mode is just normal, but you can sort of see where we're going with it. Let's just change that blend mode, maybe to multiply, so we can see it better. Then we can turn the opacity down, say 25%. Or if you prefer, go down to color burn. You can do something like that. Alright, so play around with it a little bit, and you can see that this particular gradient is a little different than the initial one that I created. Maybe because the blend mode is different. But this is really one of the fun parts about texturing in Modo, is because we have a lot of these different options, and they all sort of work together. You just have to understand the logic. I'm going to turn all these back on to get us back to our boot. Let that resolve a little bit. That's looking pretty good. Great. Well, I think we're ready to move on. Alright, so now let's turn our attention to texturing the head. Now there's quite a bit of information up here, so we have several things to texture, several different kinds of maps to take a look at. And so what I thought would be a good idea is to split out the geometry into different geometry layers so that we can really focus on the individual pieces that we need to texture. So I'm going to turn off what I don't want to look at, and the first thing we're going to talk about are the eyelashes and the eyebrows. Okay, we're going to be using a different kind of map to represent those. I'm going to hop over to my shader tab. I'm going to hit F8 to bring up preview. And so as this starts to populate, we're going to talk about how to create the stencil map and what we get from it. So you can see the artwork that I've created on the actual map and what effect we're getting here in preview. I have this in our lists tab. Let me just double click on this, and with this image selected in my shader tree, I'll just select that UV map that image is targeting so that we can have a look at both. So we can kind of look at everything that's going on. So you can see that our UVs are red. So the reason that is red, if you remember, is that we have overlapping geometry, right? Which is exactly what we want. When we created our UVs, we created one side for our eyelashes and for our eyebrows, and then we mirrored those over after we've UV'd them. And so that's why we have this red here. Okay, and you can see the graphic as it's, within the artwork, within this UV space, you can see how it's being applied, how it's targeting that UV. So again, let's just take that material, go to our texture locator, under projection type, UV map, and again, we're just targeting that UV eyelashes map that we created. So the way that a stencil map works, it's a black and white map. What happens is that it blocks out, or I should say it knocks out the negative space around the marks that we make. So in this case, we've made these eyelashes, these fibers, and it's knocking out that negative space. And so we get this look of individual hairs. And you can see also that's the same idea we're using for the eyebrows themselves. All right, so let's take a look a little closer at the artwork for the eyelashes and how it's created. All right, so I'm going to hop over to Photoshop. I'm going to share with you the UV map and then this master texture file for our eyelashes. So we know how to open up an EPS, and if we get information on this Photoshop document, you can see it's a 2K map. You can go a little higher than 2K, like a 4K map if you want. You can always scale it down. I'd recommend not going below 2K because there's a lot of detailed information here because we have these fibers. What I've done is I use photo reference quite a bit, whether I'm drawing from it or drawing over it in this case, or just using it to look at as I'm drawing something or painting something. All right, so I want to encourage you to do as much reference as you can. I found these eyelashes on the internet, and you can see that I've sort of chopped them up and put them in a rough arc just to follow my UV map. I'm using that as a guide, and then I've scaled this back in opacity just so that I can draw over them to create the artwork of these lashes, and that's exactly what I did. So on this layer on top, you can see that the fibers don't go beyond the front side of our lashes here, and I've done that for the upper, and I've also done that for the lower. Again, we'll just turn off what we don't want, which now this is exactly what I want, which is a black and white image. I'm going to export this, save it as a JPEG image, and bring that back into Modo. Again, we've targeted those UVs, we've applied it, we've set our effect from diffuse color. We just right click on this and then come down to special effects to stencil, and it's going to give us this nice simulated fiber look. Now the material that's underneath the lashes, that's this graphic, is set to black, and it is also double-sided. Now we've used double-sided materials before in her dress and also in her shirt, and that it allows us to cast a shadow, and also in this particular case it's useful in case our camera angle changes. So we don't know necessarily if we're going to have a low shot where we're going to be looking up underneath the lashes, or if we're going to have a high shot that's going to be looking down. So a double-sided material, it solves that problem for us because we're going to have artwork on both sides and we get cast shadows from it. So I think that wraps up the eyelashes and eyebrows. The eyebrows, again, they're created the exact same way. The only difference really with the eyebrow material is that it's a different color. So you can see it's set to a sort of a dark brown. Okay, again, it also is double-sided. The shadow here is a little bit more subtle, but it's still there. All right, so let's move on to another part.